Bismillah. As I was saying, let's just first do an overview of what we've seen. Here's Microsoft Word, the welcome page. Let's open a blank document. We've seen some options in the Home tab, including font type, font size, lists, text positioning, and some specific changes related to text and writing. Okay, we've seen how to make text bold, italic, underlined, and everything. Then we moved on to the insert tab. We've seen how to insert pictures, shapes, how to combine shapes, how to, for example, insert page numbers, and everything. Okay, so now we will be moving on to the references tab. Okay, we will be moving on to the references tab and specifically to the table of contents. Table of contents is called al-fahras in Arabic. Now, what it does is it helps you index your document properly. Okay, so for example, you will have the title of the chapter or the section, and next to it you will have the page where you will find that section or chapter or that component specifically. Now, before we can do the table of contents, we first have to have a well-structured document. Now, what I mean by a well-structured document is a document that is, for example, organized into, for example, chapters, sections, subsections, and everything of the sort. Okay. Now, your document first has to be organized, so you can insert a table of content at the top. So, for example, let's go and make a title. Let's go back to the home folder. Let's center the title, for example. Let's increase the text size. Let's make it bold. Let's choose an appropriate font. For example, let's go with title. This is just to show an example. Okay, now let's decrease the font size to 14 and start writing. For example, this is regular text. Now, how to organize the document in order for it to be indexed by the table of contents? We cannot just be using normal text. Okay, we have to use these heading styles. Okay, here you have heading, heading 1, heading 2, and everything. Okay, so let's go with heading 1, for example, and let's call it chapter 1, for example. Chapter 1. And now let's, for example, write anything as the content of the first chapter, for example. Now, if, for example, we only have chapters, we continue using heading 1, the heading 1 style in this example. But, for example, if your chapter contains, for example, multiple sections, multiple subsections, you have to use heading 2, for example. This one is to represent section 1. Okay, section 1. For example, now we can for example, go even further and use the heading 3 style to represent that represents subsections. Now, what you need to know about these heading styles is that they are hierarchical, same as chapters, sections, and subsections. For example, a chapter can contain multiple sections. A section can contain multiple subsections. For example, everything from here on out, this entire content is contained within chapter 1. For example, if we click on this arrow, we can minimize the content of chapter 1. Okay. Now, why is this available? Is to make the document easier to read. For example, if you've finished writing or reading chapter 1, you can minimize it like so and move on to writing chapter 2 or reading chapter 2. It makes it easier to stay organized. Okay, now notice when I clicked on this arrow, everything below just disappeared because everything below is part of chapter 1, is contained within chapter 1. Now, for example, if I do this with section 1, notice the changes. Okay, so subsection 1 is a part of section 1. Section 1 is a part of chapter 1. For example, if we use heading 3 to write, for example, subsection 2, now this subsection is the second subsection contained within the section 1. Okay, now if we, for example, want to create another section, we go to the heading 2 style and select, just write, for example, section 2. You can name it however you want. You can name it any name you want. It's just for illustration purposes. For example, we can insert an image here. For example, let's insert this page here. Okay, now if, for example, we create, let's go to heading 3 and for example, this subsection is called subsection 1, which is the same as this subsection here. For example, if we minimize subsection 1, if we minimize, for example, section 1, section 2 remains as is, because section 2 is a separate section of from section 1, but it's still within chapter 1. For example, if we minimize the chapter 1, everything disappeared because this subsection is a part of section 2, which is in its own right a part of chapter 1. Is it clear? Is everything clear? Do you understand what I've said so far? Okay, so moving on. Notice here we have heading 4 and heading 5. We can go down as much as we want. Depends on our document really, but the most used, the lowest you probably would like to go is heading 3 or heading 4. Okay, now as I've said, heading 1 is for chapters, heading 2 is for sections, heading 3 is for subsections. Okay, so for example, let's create another chapter. Let's insert a page break to better let's go with a page break to better organize the document. And let's go back to the home tab, select heading 1 and then chapter 2. This now is the second chapter of the document. Same thing, we can, for example, create sections within this chapter. Let's name them something else. For example, let's go with illustration. This now is the first section of the second chapter. We can even insert a shape. Let's, for example, go with this one. Let's, for example, let's go and insert a subsection. Let's use heading 3 and for example S1. Now we can write some regular text. of the second chapter. Let's, for example, insert some blank spaces, and let's create another section. So we'll be using heading 2 style. Now section 2, let's call it demonstration, for example. Let's go with demonstration. Let's leave this section, for example, with some spaces. Now the reason why I'm inserting now blank spaces is to see later when we insert a table of content how we can manipulate the page numbers and everything using the table of contents. Okay, so the content here is irrelevant. It's just the basic how can I say this, the basic structure of the document is the thing that matters. Okay, so let's, for example, insert our final chapter. Let's go with chapter 3. Let's give it just a single, for example, we can go with a single section. For example, so, and let's give it a section but no subsections. For example, let's give it another section, related studies. Let's insert some blank spaces and let's give it another section. Another thing, we can modify these heading styles just by right clicking on them and going with modify. We can modify the size, make them bold, italic. We can even change the color. For example, let's change it to black. Now everything written using this heading style changed. Okay, we can do the same for the heading 2 style also. We can modify it. For example, let's make it italic. Let's, for example, change the color, the same color, to black. Let's leave the subsections as they are, for example. Okay, another thing we need to do is to insert page numbers. Let's go with the bottom of the page. For example, let's make them centered and close the footer. Now our pages are numbered, as you can see. Now another thing is we want to insert a page break. Okay, because you would want your document to stay organized, so leave the content and the table of content separate. Meaning, for example, if and when the table of content, for example, ends in the middle of the page, you shouldn't make your document start in the same page as a table of content. It's good practice to insert a page break, for example. Let's go with a page break and use the first page. We have to go back to the first page, and then now when our document is organized, is a well-structured document, we can go to the References tab and go to the Table of Contents option, and now we have the option with automatic table 1, automatic table 2, or a manual table. We can also create a custom table of contents, okay? Like this, for example. We can change some things here. We can customize it. For example, you can show multiple levels. For example, let's cancel and let's go back to automatic table 1. Let's go with automatic table 1, and just like that, it created the table of contents. Okay, now for automatic table 1, we can go to automatic table 2. Okay, so this option here, update table. Now we have update page numbers only and update the entire table. Now what's the difference between them? For example, let's go and add a subsection or a section to this chapter. Okay, let's go to another page, for example, and let's use the heading 2 style to insert a section. Like this. And let's go back to our table of contents. Let's go to update table and let's, for example, update page numbers only. Notice the new section didn't appear, but it updated the page numbers that the old sections and chapters and subsections were written at. For example, in this case, when we add new sections, subsections, or chapters to our document, when updating the table of contents, we should update the entire table. Okay? Now, when we updated the entire table, notice here in chapter 2, section 1 appeared. Okay? We didn't have section 1 before, but when we updated the page numbers, only the page numbers of the previously written sections, subsections, and chapters were updated, but not the new additions, which is, in this case, is section 1 in chapter 2. Okay, now just when I chose update the entire table, now section S1 or section 1 appeared. For example, let's remove, let's go and remove for example, a chapter. Let's remove a chapter, for example, like so. And now when we click on update table, the chapter disappeared. Let's go with Control Z now to revert the changes. Now let's revert the changes. Now this, let's try it with subsection 1 and subsection 2. Let's remove these. Subsection 1 and subsection 2. When we removed subsection 1 and subsection 2, now they were within section 1 of chapter 1. Now they are not on the table, okay? Now if, for example, let's add another chapter at the end. Let's insert a page break and let's add a new chapter. Let's go with heading 1, and now we have chapter, for example, let's say chapter 4. Let's go with chapter 4. Now chapter 4 is exactly in the 8th page. Now if we update page numbers only, notice nothing happened. But if we update the entire table, now chapter 4 appears. For example, let's go ahead and insert a page break here, so that chapter 2 now will be found in the 4th page and not the 3rd page, okay? Now if we, for example, update the table, if we choose update number, notice that chapter 2 now will change to 4. Chapter 2's position will change to 4. Okay? As I've said, update the entire table, looks for changes in page numbers, and also in new additions, new modifications that you made. For example, if you change the name of the chapter, for example, let's go with chapter 1, let's make it introduction, for example. Let's, for example, update page numbers only, no changes. But for example, if we update the entire table, now the modification that we made to chapter 1, now its name was changed to introduction. Okay? Any questions? Do you have any questions on table of contents? Now, I've shown you the difference between updating the entire table and updating just the page numbers. if you have any questions, just let me know. Do you understand everything we've seen thus far? Now we can also remove the table of contents like this and just go with one like so. For example, this is an example of a custom table of contents. Now we can also go and remove the table of contents from here. And go with something of this sort. Any questions? No questions? So if there are no more questions, I guess we'll meet next session, inshallah. Now, I would love to do a regular session in a classroom, but we can only do so after I consult with with Mr. Dowdy. Now, after I see if there is an appropriate time and an empty classroom for us to do the session, I will let you know via email. If not, we will be doing an online session as usual. Okay, so if there are no further questions, no problem. So if there are no further questions, I guess next week, inshallah.